If you're studying A-level philosophy or religious studies, subscribe. I'm covering the entire course on this channel. In this lecture, we're going to look at one of the most important developments in utilitarian ethics, the distinction between act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. Earlier philosophers like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill established the basic utilitarian principle that actions are morally right if they produce the greatest happiness for the greatest number. However, later philosophers began to ask an important question. How exactly should we apply that principle in practice? Should we judge every individual action based purely on its consequences? Or should we follow general moral rules that tend to produce the greatest happiness over time? This debate led to the development of two different approaches to utilitarianism: act and rule. Understanding the difference between these two approaches is essential for A-level ethics because it helps explain how utilitarianism tried to deal with its biggest criticisms. So let's recap what utilitarianism is, the core ideas. It's a form of consequentialism, which means that the morality of an action depends on its consequences more than the intentions of or rules. So Jeremy Bentham argued that human beings are governed by pleasure and by pain, and that the goal of morality should be to maximize pleasure and minimize suffering. John Stuart Mill later refined Bentham's theory by introducing the idea that pleasures differ in quality as well as quantity. But both thinkers agreed on the central utilitarian principle: the morally right action is the one that produces the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. The question that later philosophers raised was how we should apply this principle consistently in everyday moral decision making. There's a little bit of historical context around the distinction between act and rule utilitarianism, which emerged in the 20th century as philosophers tried to respond to criticisms of Bentham's theory. Bentham's version focused strongly on calculating the consequences of individual actions. However, critics pointed out that this approach could sometimes justify actions that seem morally troubling. For example, if sacrificing one innocent person produced greater happiness for many others, act utilitarian reasoning might appear to justify the action. And in response to these concerns, some philosophers proposed rule utilitarianism, which attempts to preserve the utilitarian focus on happiness while introducing more stable moral rules. And this development shows how philosophical theories often evolve over time as thinkers respond to criticisms and refine earlier ideas. So what is the central question of both? Well, act utilitarianism argues, or asks the question rather, should we judge each individual action by its consequences? And rule utilitarianism asks, should we follow rules that generally maximize happiness? And that distinction will shape how a utilitarian approaches a real-world ethical scenario and respond to key criticisms. So let's have a look at the key concepts. What is act utilitarianism? Well, it's the most direct interpretation of utilitarian ethics. According to act utilitarianism, each individual action should be judged solely by its consequences. Whenever we face a moral decision, we should ask which action will produce the most amount of happiness, the greatest overall happiness in that particular situation. And this approach reflects Bentham's original idea that moral reasoning should focus on calculating pleasure and pain. And the advantage of this utilitarian principle is that it allows moral decisions to be flexible and responsive to circumstances. Instead of following fixed rules, we get to evaluate each situation individually. Let's take a look at some act utilitarianism in practice. Imagine a situation where telling a lie could prevent a serious harm and save a life. Someone's perhaps hiding from a violent attacker. You're asked, where are they? A strict moral rule would say that lying is always wrong. An act utilitarianism would focus on the consequences of that particular situation. So if lying prevents serious harm and increases overall happiness, then the lie would be morally justified. And this example shows how act utilitarianism emphasizes the consequences of individual actions, not just any fixed moral rules. You could take the idea of breaking a small promise. That could be right if it prevents a greater harm, like cancelling your lunch plans to help someone in crisis. Or perhaps stealing some medicine to save a dying child could be justified if the happiness gained outweighs the harm caused by that theft. Of course, there are moral decisions that people make that are influenced by their own morality, and this is where act utilitarianism helps you calculate what would bring about the greatest amount of happiness. And so there are strengths and weaknesses. Some of the key strengths is that it's flexible. We've mentioned this. It adapts to unique situations and contexts. And it allows moral reasoning to respond to complex real-world circumstances. It also avoids the rigid moral rules. And so if a strict rule is applied against lying, and that could cause serious harm, act utilitarianism will allow you to reconsider the consequences. And that flexibility makes it attractive to philosophers who believe morality should respond to the complexities of real human situations. It's also very intuitive. It can align with what your gut instinct would be in an emergency, and you're not going to delay the treatment or hold back saving someone because of a moral rule that forbids you. And so therefore there is no absolute rules. It avoids that rigidity of a deontological ethical system. But some of its criticisms are, for example, its justice problem or justice objection. If an action that harms an innocent person produces greater happiness overall, act utilitarian reasoning might appear to justify it. Philosophers often illustrate this with dramatic thought experiments. So, for example, imagine sacrificing one healthy patient to save 5 others needing an organ transplant. Most people feel instinctively that this would be morally wrong, even if it produced greater happiness overall. You can think of the trolley cart experiment and look that up and see that as the classic scenario, the classic thought experiment that people often use for the situation. Could justify punishing an innocent person if you follow act utilitarianism. It's also very unpredictable. You can't calculate all of the consequences that are going to happen accurately in advance. And it's incredibly impractical at times because it requires a constant moral calculation in every single situation, which can be quite burdensome. Let's have a look at the other key concept, rule utilitarianism. Well, it attempts to address problems by focusing on general moral rules rather than the individual actions. According to rule utilitarianists, we should follow rules that tend to produce the greatest happiness when generally adopted by society. Examples could include rules like telling the truth, keeping promises, respecting individual rights. Rule utilitarianism therefore tries to combine the utilitarian goal of maximizing happiness with the practical benefits of having reliable moral rules. The idea is that if everyone generally follows the rule that you've identified, would it maximize happiness? Yes, and it would make society more stable and overall happiness would increase. So if you follow the rule, even if breaking it might produce more happiness in one individual case, if you followed the rule, it could maximize happiness in society because it becomes more stable. Let's have a look at that in practice. So we could have a look at the idea that if you keep promises. A rule utilitarian follows the rule, focuses on the rule and follows it by keeping their promise every single time. Because they believe that society is going to function better if you are a reliable person and keep your promise. So even if breaking one promise for one person might produce a little bit of happiness in a specific case, it's not going to bring about the overall happiness. If you think about telling the truth, it maximizes long-term happiness because you're maintaining trust, perhaps in an organization or in a system. A rule utilitarian wouldn't lie even if it seemed beneficial for one person. Let's take the rule of respecting property, like don't steal. That creates, again, a stable society. People start to feel more safe and secure. They realize that their overall feeling of happiness is increased when they know that theft is low or minimal, or, something which is a positive environment to live in. And so they would advocate against stealing something like medicine to save a dying child. And so there are strengths and weaknesses with rule utilitarianism. If we have a look at one of the key strengths here is that it protects justice. It stops individuals sacrificing things for the majority. It keeps things very consistent, you might argue. It's also very practical. You don't have to work out and calculate the consequences all the time because you're able to stick to a set of rules. And it becomes far more predictable because you're creating rules which create social stability and trust. So you're able to, within the framework of those rules, start to predict what the likely future outcomes are going to be. You can say general, predictable ideas like, society will be more stable, people will have more trust in us. But there are criticisms. It's incredibly inflexible at times. Rules provide less happiness in some certain exceptional cases overall. And that rigidity doesn't allow any built-in flexibility. And there's a rule conflict. What happens when there are two happiness maximizing rules that clash? If you're deciding that actually this rule, which is contrary to this rule, rule A is contrary to rule B, and both of them can bring about maximal happiness to some extent in society later on, you now have a rule clash. Which rule do you break? And if you're not allowed to break a rule, well, there's a contradiction there. And some people say that it forces people to kind of push back to act utilitarianism. So it's not truly utilitarian as well. So either people jump ship and they go back to Bentham's model, or they abandon those core principles of maximizing happiness, which is what the aim of utilitarian principles are all about. If the focus is too much just on the rules, you will miss the bigger picture. Now, why does all of this matter for A-level essays? Well, mastering the difference between these two is crucial for crafting a sophisticated exam answer and achieving higher grades. Exam questions often ask you to evaluate whether utilitarianism provides a convincing approach to moral decision making. And so a strong essay might explain how utilitarianism emphasizes flexibility and direct calculation of consequences, while rule utilitarianism introduces general moral rules to avoid injustice. And so you can use the distinction to critically assess the theory's strengths and weaknesses using specific examples. And so you can build in more robust arguments by addressing those common criticisms, like the tyranny of the majority or impracticality, by referencing the different forms of how you can apply utilitarianism. And you've got multiple scenarios. I've given you a few in this in these set of slides, where you can apply each approach to hypothetical ethical dilemmas and explain why a particular approach would be better in a given situation. So always specify the key language in your essays, the difference between act and rule, rather than just utilitarianism as a general concept, and that brings a lot more clarity and a lot more precision.